We thank God for once again enabling us to go through this journey, through the Bible. Now we are in the book of Exodus. The book of Exodus is the second book of the Bible. It is after the book of Genesis, which we said is the book of beginnings. This word Exodus is a Greek word that means exit or departure. And according to the title, the story that we are going to read or to go through in the book of Exodus is the departure of God's chosen people from Egypt to Canaan, the promised land. The word Exodus appears again in Exodus 19, verses 1, and also appears in the New Testament in the book of Luke, chapter 9, verses 31, and also Hebrews 11, verses 22, and 2 Peter chapter 1 and verses 15. The author of the book is Moses, and there are several references of his authorship. In the book itself, you read him as the author in chapter 17 and verses 14, and chapter 24, verses 4 and 7, chapter 34, verses 27 to 28. Also, Jesus mentions about Moses as an author in Mark 7 and verses 10, and also Luke 20, verses 37, and also Paul mentions about Moses as an author in Romans 10 and verses 5. The book of Exodus starts from where Genesis ends, with the death of Joseph, and it gives us a story of God's people after the death of Joseph for almost 300 years, when a new failure arises who does not recognize the Israelites and sees them as a threat. During this time, we are told that the Israelites had prospered physically, and they had also increased in number in chapter 1 and verses 7. The book records God's act of saving the people, his people, and establishing them as a covenant people who becomes now a nation. The book of Exodus also gives us a picture of this chosen nation called to serve and also to represent God to the other nations as they live according to his commands. The major events are described in this book are, number one, the enslavement and oppression in Egypt, God's preparation and call of Moses as a leader, and the conflict in Egypt between the God of Israel, Yahweh, and the gods of Egypt, of course, under the leadership of Pharaoh. Then we see the event of the Passover night and the departure of God's people from Egypt, and later on camping at Sinai, where God establishes them as a nation with a covenant, which is actually continuation of the covenant that he made with Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, verses 2, and Genesis 15, verses 13 and 14. We also see Israelites, though they are chosen God's people, rebelling against him. And we see God's provision for their relationship, which is symbolized by his presence at the tabernacle that they built for him as per the pattern that he gave to Moses. So the key themes in the book are the redemption of his own people, and I want to believe the outline will help us as we read it. The outline of the book of Exodus, number 1, we see Israel in Egypt, chapter 1, verses 1 to chapter 4, verses 31. Under this A, we have slavery and oppression of God's people, chapter 1, verses 1 to 22. Preparation and call of Moses from chapter 2, verses 1 to chapter 4, verses 31. Number 2, we see deliverance of God's people, which is in chapter 5, verses 1 to chapter 14, verses 31. Under this, we have A, conflict of true God and the Egyptian gods, which is in chapter 5, verses 1 to chapter 11, verses 10. And B, redemption by the blood of the Lamb, which is in chapter 12. C, the redemption by divine miracle, chapter 13, verses 1 to chapter 14, verses 31. Number 3, God's people in the wilderness, which is in chapter 15, verses 1 to chapter 18, verses 27. A, we see the song of victory sung by God's people, which is in chapter 15, verses 1 to 21. Testing in the wilderness, B, chapter 15, verses 22 to chapter 17, verses 16. And C, leadership of Moses being delegated to others, which is chapter 18, verses 1 to 27. Number 4, the consecration of God's people at Mount Sinai, chapter 19, verses 1 to chapter 34, verses 35. And under this we see God's people accepting the law, which is in chapter 19, verses 1 to chapter 31, verses 18. B, God's people rebelling against the law, rebellion against the law, which is chapter 32, verses 1 to 35. C, restoration of God's people, chapter 33, verse 1 to chapter 34, verses 35. Number 5, worship in the tabernacle, which is chapter 35, verses 1 to chapter 40, verses 38. A, under this we see offerings of God's people and workmen for the tabernacle, which is in chapter 35, verses 1 to 35. B, construction and furnishing of the tabernacle, which is in chapter 36, verses 1 to chapter 39, verses 43. And lastly, God's glory fills the tabernacle in chapter 30, verses 1 to 38. There are several insights in the book of Exodus, but just a few. I am sure you will get many. It's just to mention some of the types of Christ that you will see in the book of Exodus as you go through it. Number 1, Moses as Christ. Number 2, the Passover lamb. Number 3, the manna provided in the wilderness. Number 4, the rock that gave water to the Israelites. Number 5, the tabernacle or the place of meeting. And number 6, oil that was to be used by the priests. And lastly, the priesthood in the book of Exodus. Those are some of the types of Christ that you see. So make note of them, and the Lord will bless you. And with that, may the Lord help us as we go through the book of Exodus. Shalom, shalom, and God bless you. Amen.